Welcome to the Kratom Advocacy Podcast. My name is Lawrence, and today we'll be sitting for a conversation with Jackie Subeck and Greg Dalli. Jackie and Greg are representatives of 7 Ohms, and they can explain their backgrounds far better than I could. So I suppose ladies first. Jack, if you want to go into how your work started with 7 Ohms and why you chose to partner up with them, essentially, and then we'll move to Greg.
Hi. Thank you, Lawrence, for having us on the show today. Really excited to be here. So, yeah, my background for the last decade, I've pretty much been in the drug policy world. I've spent a chunk of it in the cannabis space in California, but working state level and local level. And I also have done some work in psychedelics. And so when the 7 Ohms guys and I met, it was sort of like an instant connection because for me, going over to Kratom, another plant, was kind of a parallel move. So it was like just learning another science, learning new words, but I already understood all of the basic science mechanisms that plants and bodies, how those things work together through cannabis. So it was a really good fit for us. And so that's essentially how I came on board. And I'm just really happy to be with these guys.
And Greg?
So for me, I actually come from the tech world. So I spent a lot of time in operations at a bunch of different tech companies, eventually moved on and started doing angel investing. And so 7 Ohms was actually one of the companies that I was an angel investor of. And so I kind of started out as an investor, and the idea behind the company was we want to do something about this opioid crisis. We are sick of seeing our friends die. We're sick of seeing family members die. We're sick of seeing people we love get strung out on pain pills. And so there's got to be a better way. And so that's kind of where we stumbled upon Kratom. And then from there, the guys who all have science backgrounds were able to find a kind of novel way of working with the plant, which then led to much more of a 7-hydroxy-mitragynine content within the plant matter that we had. And that's kind of the product that we launched. Once we launched, it kind of became pretty apparent that the market wants this. And then the guys asked me to come on and help run the business side of things since they're all scientists. So that has kind of been where we are at. And yeah, this is basically, we're just now kind of coming on our first full year of being on the market, but we've really only kind of made a major dent for the last 6 months. And so it's been a pretty wild ride kind of watching things progress and take off.
That's really cool. And can you, for the layman who's watching, explain the chemical structure of 7-hydroxymitragynine and maybe how it differs from other alkaloids or metabolites found in Kratom, like, say, regular mitragynine?
Yeah, so in terms of how 7-hydroxymitragynine interacts with the body, a lot of these alkaloids are meant to interact with different receptors that we have in our body. So specifically, 7-hydroxymitragynine focuses on the mu-opioid receptor, which deals with pain relief, euphoria, focus, things like that. And so think of your receptors in your body as a lock and the different alkaloids and chemicals and things as keys. And so a lot for the most part, most alkaloids are not going to fit most things. So there's 40, 50 different alkaloids within the kratom leaf. Most of them don't really do anything. Most of them we haven't really studied enough to really know for sure. But 7-hydroxymitragynine in specific is like a really perfect key for the mu-opioid receptor. And so the reason why that is such an important thing is you don't need to take as much of it to get an effect. Versus if you look at like morphine or something from the poppy plant, it does interact with the mu-opioid receptor, but it's not as great of like a key lock pairing as 7-hydroxymitragynine, which is why you need to take a lot more to get a similar effect.
What are the pros and cons of 7-hydroxymitragynine in comparison to standard leaf kratom?
Yeah, so probably the main benefit is that it is much more potent. So you don't need to take as much in order to get the effect that you're looking for. So right now, the product that we have on the market is a 14 milligram tablet. 7-hydroxymitragynine is around 26 times more potent than regular mitragynine. So you think, 26 times 14, if you wanted to have a similar effect with regular mitragynine, you would need somewhere around 364 milligrams or something like that of regular mitragynine. And so when you get into that realm, you kind of start to see a lot of issues with taking that much plant matter. So the people that kind of toss and wash, they either have to take magnesium or other supplements, or you'll see that the mitragynine and the regular kratom leaf starts to create oxalates, which is really not good for your kidneys. And that leads to kidney stones and kind of other things. And similarly for your liver has to work a lot harder to break down a lot of plant matter. Like as much as like plant matter is great, and vegetarian life has its benefits, the specific plant that the kratom leaf kind of is, you're not really able to metabolize the amount that you generally need to take to get the effects you're looking for without taking some other types of supplements.
Could I just add something? Can I add
Sure.
to that? Yeah, I just want to add one further thing, which is the ability for consistent dosing. Because anytime you're working with a plant, plants are fickle. They are never exactly the same. But one of the great things about 7-hydroxy is that it can be completely controlled in consistent dosing. So you can repeat the process over and over again as you're manufacturing products. And therefore, you're able to monitor how it affects you, when it affects you, how much you should have. And you don't have to be concerned. The consumer doesn't have to be concerned about, am I getting too much dose? Am I not getting enough dose? So I think just generally the consistency of dosing is a big positive about 7-hydroxy as well.
For sure. And I know right now, a lot of different coalitions and organizations are touting 7-hydroxymitragynine as an opiate replacement. There's this debate raging right now about whether it's a dietary supplement or a novel drug. And what would you say, weigh in on that debate, specifically in the context of using it to replace opiates either for addiction or pain management?
Well,
Yeah.
Oh, you want to go take it, Greg? Go for it.
Go for it.
I'll start. All right. So, well, for starters, it's a naturally occurring compound. So anytime you've got a naturally occurring compound that isn't synthesized, that leads to potential for it to be classified as a dietary supplement. It's also been traditionally used by, Southeast Asian cultures for hundreds, maybe potentially thousands of years in the leaf form. And so also additionally, 7-hydroxy and kratom in general will fall under the protection of the Dietary Supplement Act of 1994, which basically allows for naturally occurring substances to be sold on the market. So you've got this situation where it's been in the market for years and it hasn't been regulated. People are using it. They're figuring out how to use it. New products are coming out all the time. So the consumer continues to have access to these natural products. And so that's one of the pros we'd say, or several of the pros we'd say in the why should it be classified as a natural supplement, a dietary supplement versus a drug? Because a drug is a whole nother beast, right? And we go through this in cannabis as well. And with drugs, you've got public safety concerns and controlled substances, and it's not quite hitting those marks, all of the different check boxes that the DEA would be interested in. So that's why I think a lot of the kratom advocates that are out there today are continuing to push it towards the dietary supplement path because it makes more sense over there.
I've heard critics kind of retort that it's found in such small amounts, it's questionable whether or not it should be classified as such. What would you say to that?
So, yeah, I totally kind of understand what they're saying. I think that we kind of saw a similar thing in the cannabis industry where if you look at cannabis from 30 or 40 years ago, the leaves maybe had 5% THC, 7% THC versus today, they're regularly coming out with 40% THC products. And so when you talk to people that are older, they'll say, man, the stuff today, that's not weed. Like that's so different than what I had before. And I think kind of the jury is kind of still out. Like it looks like in cannabis, we've kind of accepted that as the products becomes more and more potent, we're still kind of calling it the same thing. As of right now in the kratom space, as these products become more and more potent, we are still kind of calling it kratom. I wouldn't be surprised if this kind of goes the way of cannabis, where, in 2 or 3 years, kratom is mostly a 7-hydroxy product. And it's just kind of considered that's just the new normal of what kratom is. I could also see a world where it becomes kind of a different classification. But I think that, the argument around like naturally occurring is it's a pretty difficult argument to make, because there are strains of kratom that have tons more 7-hydroxy than what we are used to seeing coming out of like Indonesia or something like that. Likewise, you can find strains of kratom that pretty much have huge occurrences of most of these alkaloids. So, but I also don't think that it's an accurate argument to point to one strain of kratom and say, well, this is natural, so thus like that kind of defeats your argument. But I think for us, the way we think about it is there's a pretty definite line between synthetically derived alkaloids and naturally converted. And so for us, we can't make anything without plants. And so we take plants in, we convert some of the regular mitragynine into 7-hydroxy, and that's kind of what we end up with. So while we end with a product that has much more 7-hydroxy than what we started with, we also are ending with a product that has virtually no mitragynine, which was not how we started with. And so kind of our perspective is that as long as you're kind of working with the plant and never deviating from that, and we're also not using any harmful solvents or anything through our process, versus you look at a lot of the synthetic products on the market and you see it regularly testing positive for hexane and other research chemicals that are pretty harmful. So I think for us, like, we are much more concerned with kind of the synthetic versus non-synthetic argument, as opposed to, how much 7-hydroxy is kind of considered to be normal within a sample.
Yes, that's interesting, because normally when I listen to these critics, the thing that they say after that is, well, I can walk into a store and I can ask for kratom in one store and be handed capsules or powder. I can walk into another store and be handed 7-hydroxy. And they usually go on to say that because 7-hydroxy is more addictive and it leaves one more vulnerable to forming a dependence, that could possibly threaten the legality of kratom. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with any of these arguments, by the way. I'm delivering this neutrally, but what would you say to that argument? Is the classification of 7-hydroxymitragynine as kratom, does it realistically threaten the legality of kratom in your perspective, or no?
I totally understand where they're coming from. I think that they have a very legitimate argument. I think if I were to look at the cannabis space, because I think that's probably the closest kind of similarity that we have, you can walk into a shop and you can get, live rosin hash, which is an order of magnitude stronger than your average pre-roll. And it seems like in that world, they've done a pretty good job educating the consumer of, like, if you're kind of a newbie, like, you should not be buying this like live rosin hash. You should be starting with something smaller. So I definitely think that there is a point to be made, which is around customer education. That's kind of why, as at 7 Ohms, we've never done any marketing or advertising, because we don't really want, we want to be really thoughtful around who we are marketing to. And until there's more research out there, which we are currently in the process of funding, we don't really want to be advertising or putting our name out there, because the jury is still out on, there's just a lot of research that hasn't been done yet. There is no, long-term use studies. There are LD50 studies, which kind of pretty clearly show that while morphine and mitragynine, regular mitragynine, do have LD50s, meaning there is a lethal dose. This study from this lab was not able to find a lethal dose for 7-hydroxy. So we kind of feel pretty good about the safety component there. But I think, getting back to your point, it's pretty unclear to me kind of how this will go down. But I do not think that having a more effective product on the market puts the entire thing at risk. I think there are plenty of areas where the kratom industry as a whole needs to get better, whether it be with labeling, with posting test results, with being more scientific and upfront with how things are being manufactured. Like, there are so many areas where we as an industry can get better and do more for the consumer to help keep them safe and educated, that kind of this like specific distinction of, like, is 7-hydroxy too strong to where it threatens like regular kratom, to me does not feel like the argument we should be focused on.
And I think that to add to that, that maybe a way for your listeners to also understand is people are familiar with CBD. And, we have two versions of CBD, even though they're both exactly the same. One of them comes from the legal cannabis plant, and one of them comes from the hemp plant. They're the same plant, but the way that the government has split them up, you end up with now products on the market like Delta 9, Delta 8 products, which are actually especially Delta 9, which is naturally converted from CBD, from hemp derived CBD, which for those people don't know is equal to less than 0.3% of THC in that product. So 7-hydroxy can somewhat be compared to a Delta 9 in the fact that it's still naturally derived and naturally converted from the original plant. Unlike a cannabis concentrate, like Greg was mentioning, which is intentionally manufactured and produced to ramp up the percentage, give you a much, much higher. In fact, some of the cannabis concentrates go up to 80, 90, 95% cannabis, THC rather. And those are obviously really, really heavy duty. But interestingly enough, we have found that both of those products and all of those products have a place in the market. So I think that we're looking at a situation where obviously Kratom is one plant. There is not a cannabis sativa and a hemp version of it. It's just one plant. But I think that there's an opportunity and a place for both types of products in the marketplace. And I think that's where we're ultimately heading. But there needs to be more research, as there does with a lot of different substances in the United States. We're just always lacking research. So it's one of the reasons that I also came to work with the 7-Ohm guys, is because these guys are about research, and these guys are about testing, and these guys are about public safety. And those things are critical when you're putting out a plant medicine out into the marketplace.
Absolutely. And to close out the criticisms I most commonly hear, one came from Dr. McCurdy, who said, well, this is a holistic experience. This plant is like an orchestra with many different instruments. And if you cut out the rest of the orchestra and you only leave the lead guitarist in, so to speak, that part's mine. How can you really can't call it Kratom anymore, because it doesn't have all of the other brother and sister alkaloids. You're just focusing on one metabolite. What would you say to that argument?
I would say right away that doesn't work for me, because I'll go right back to cannabis, where we have, instead of alkaloids, we've got cannabinoids. And so what someone's saying is, okay, Dr. McCurdy saying, okay, well, if we pull THC out and we have a THC isolate product, or a CBG isolate product, or a THCA isolate product, that those are no longer cannabis, but in fact they are. And so I think that as the discussion continues, as more research happens, as more states come online, and more advocacy continues, that we're going to have to, we're working really hard to sort of figure out how those things work together from a regulatory perspective, so that there can be room in the market for both, but they don't necessarily have to be different products. It can still continue to be under the Kratom bubble, but there's different levels of products. There's different levels of products for different people. Like Greg was saying, they don't want to market to certain people with different, with certain products. So it's the same thing in cannabis. You don't want to start sending a brand new person and tell them to go get a really heavy concentrate. That's just crazy. So you want to start low, go slow. And I think that's the same situation in Kratom.
Yeah, I think also to build on that, I've kind of heard this argument around the orchestra. I think that for me, the biggest issue here is that a lot of these other alkaloids within the kratom leaf have not been studied. And you look at like this, I was referring earlier to the LD50 study that looks at the lethal dose for things. And there is no lethal dose for 7-hydroxy, but there is a lethal dose for mitragynine. And why is that? We don't really understand. And similarly, there's all these other alkaloids that there's very little research. And some of the little research that is out there does not suggest great things. And I don't want to like give specifics, because the reality is we just don't have enough research. So I don't want to, prematurely rule anything out. But a lot of these things are completely unstudied and unknown. So, if we're going to use kind of this orchestral analogy, like what I would say is that like 7-hydroxy would be kind of like a Yo-Yo Ma playing like a Vivaldi violin solo. And the argument being made here is like, well, you have these like 50 other people that you don't really understand what instrument they play. You don't really understand if they're even any good or kind of like how they will play with someone. You just have this one thing that has been studied to be safe and is going to be pretty great. And so to say that kind of like Yo-Yo Ma soloing Vivaldi on the violin is not considered classical music or is not considered orchestral music, I just don't really agree with, especially when the alternative is you have to blindly accept all these other things that haven't been studied, vetted, or proven to be safe.
And what consumer education, which you mentioned before, is 7 Ohms engaged in now, and any activism you're partaking in?
The main thing that we started out doing was transparency around test results. So I think even now we're probably the only company in this Kratom or 7-hydroxy space that regularly updates and posts test results. Like one of our competitors, if you scan the QR code on their packaging that says, look here for test results, it leads to a propane website. A lot of them just are dead links and it's just, random QR codes. But I think that's kind of the biggest thing is know what you're putting in your body and, understand how safe or not safe something is. You have other websites like testmykratom.org as an example where they're kind of posting, and I think our products have been tested on there too, but they're kind of posting from all around the community and you're seeing, some results have hexane in them, some results have other research chemicals, some of them are like, there's a lot of like not great things, and that kind of corresponds with what you see online of people like saying, hey, I took this other product, I've been taking it for 2 weeks, and now like my urine is like some weird color, or I'm like nauseous and throwing up. And that's probably not because of 7-hydroxy. That's probably not because of raw mitragynine. That's probably because of, other research chemicals and other things being put in that substance. So step one for us was just visibility and transparency around what is in the product that we are selling to you. Step two is probably going to be more focused on the research side. So while we feel pretty confident based on the research out there that you're not going to overdose and die from 7-hydroxy, we still don't really know like what long-term use does for you, what, how body weight, how, different types of genetics and biological things affect your experience of 7-hydroxy. So that's kind of where we are focused next. Is we originally kind of went down the road of, is someone doing this research? Like, can we just like support them or figure out a way? It does not seem like anyone is really interested in doing any kind of longer term studies with humans on how this affects you. So that's kind of where we're going now is, going towards the research path, because our belief is without that, it just kind of becomes a never ending echo chamber of some people say, this is great, this changed my life. And some people say, this is harmful, this is dangerous, why are you doing this?
And I can add to that on the educational component of this, that in addition to consumer education, one of the roles that I, have in my world as a government affairs person is educating lawmakers, and not just lawmakers, but lawmaker staff. I have taken trips up to our Capitol and visited all kinds of lawmakers. And for starters, I went through the building one day and like 2 people in the whole building had even ever heard of Kratom. So it's hard to write a law about something that you don't even know what it is. So we took it upon ourselves at 7 Ohms to start educating the lawmakers from the very basics, which is even how to pronounce the words, right? It's something, it seems silly, but if they can't say the words, again, how do you write laws about them? We had one lawmaker that wanted to support the bill, didn't know the first thing about Kratom, but knew that there was an aspect of protecting the kids in it, protecting the kids. And that lawmaker was all about protecting the kids. So it was like, okay, well, this one protects the kids, then we're in. And it's like, okay, again, that sounds great, but we need to educate the lawmakers, and at all levels, not just at the state, all the way down to local, depending on the situation. And I've been doing that for years and years and years. And I find that it's very effective, and they're very open to learning about it, getting, going in easy, giving them the bullet points, the high level stuff, and then if they want to know more, you can feed them more. But I think that that's like a missed opportunity sometimes when you have lobbyists and working and running around trying to pass policy, is they skip over the education piece for the lawmakers. And I think that ultimately helps create better policy if lawmakers understand what it is they're even talking about.
Speaking of law, what legal battles or challenges are you currently facing?
I mean, I think the biggest battle that we have, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a battle. I don't think there's necessarily like a specific person we're fighting with, but I think just educating the market and educating lawmakers on how to continue to let this ecosystem develop in a safe and responsible way.
Yeah, because what ends up happening is someone will come in and give them the information that benefits them and or their company. And then if that's all the information they get, then that's what they have to work with. And so a lot of times it's incorrect, it's misleading, it's even bordering on propaganda and fear. And they're using those things to get what they want to be able to wipe out the competition. And so we have to make sure that we get in there and fight these battles. And so some of the battles that we've been fighting are not, like Greg said, they're not really battles, but they're finding a way to find consensus on policy items that aren't regulated yet, like labeling. What do you put on a Kratom label, right? Is there such thing as a recommended dose? We've discussed this over and over again. We don't necessarily have all the answers for something like that yet. And really nobody does, because each human body is different. So, an argument was made to me, well, you can't create a recommended dose you can't say that every human should eat 2,000 calories a day and that's how it should go, because that's not the case. One person might eat 1,000 calories a day and one person might need 3,000 calories a day. So that's just one example, a recommended dose, but these are the conversations we're having: how to measure it, how to, what items get listed on the label. And we went through that in cannabis too. And it's a kind of a hard fight, because you have people who don't want certain things listed, but at 7ohms, we really truly believe in transparency. So, it's important to us that certain things get listed, regardless of whether or not there's other folks that might not want them listed.
I know that 7-hydroxy is excellent for pain. What percentage of people are using it for its analgesic effects versus just recreationally, would you say, or estimate, if you could?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough one. I mean, I can tell you based on the data we have, which is, we get, hundreds of emails from people saying, thank you, I got my life back. I'm now, able to stay off of heroin or fentanyl. We get a whole nother group of emails. It's like, I, have been having pain issues for a long time, and this is, something that has really helped me. But unfortunately, we don't really get a lot of emails from people saying like, hey, this is my favorite recreational experience. So I think the data that we have is pretty skewed towards like medical and lifestyle. Yeah, I honestly don't know. Honestly, Lawrence, I imagine from you doing this podcast, you probably have a much better idea than me. What would you say?
I would say that I've spoken with lots of people who say that it's changed their lives for the better, and I've spoken with people who have said that it's ruined their lives. I don't know their backgrounds on either side. I do know that I remember I tried it once, and I could see why you would get addicted to it, but I had pain at the time as well, and it eliminated my pain. So I wouldn't be able to give a very good answer, or at least a scientific one. I don't know. I would say I've seen both in pretty equal measure. So maybe by the end of the season, I'll be able to give a better educated answer.
Yeah, I'd be really curious to understand that, because I imagine if you're doing it for recreational purposes, there's probably much better options out there.
I would say for the people who would use it recreationally, it's if you're kind of unambitious, I don't know if this is the right vocabulary to use with your use and abuse of substances, you the accessibility of it would appeal to some people more than perhaps the potency of it. That I will say. because where I am now, it's everywhere. But
Yeah.
I'm neutral. I don't really understand the market enough to make an educated opinion.
Gotcha.
The laryngitis is getting me. Sorry. Anyway, to continue, well, would you be willing to kind of like, I'm not a prohibitionist. Would you be willing to like allude to the fact that the product can be habit forming on the packaging?
Yeah. So it's very difficult to fit everything that we would like on our packaging because our packaging is not very big. But from day one, we have kind of listed our disclaimer on our website and linked to that on our packaging. And so that has the much more detailed list of all the stuff, including the fact that it can be habit forming.
Okay. And many pharmacologists are interested in scheduling it as a drug. What would you say to these people? Good idea, bad idea? I can imagine I anticipate your answer, but
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think scheduling anything without the research, I think is not a good idea. I don't think that 7-hydroxy has presented as dangerous to the point where it needs to be scheduled before we kind of understand what we have here. But that being said, if we do the research and kind of from that, it's pretty clear that this is something that needs to be scheduled, then for sure. I mean, ultimately, like as I was saying earlier, like the team originally did this because they were sick of their friends dying from heroin and fentanyl and oxycodone. So,
for sure.
like if it turns out that like from a safety perspective, this is actually something like maybe sure there's no lethal dose, but maybe there's other kind of safety issues that need to be factored in. Then yeah, I don't think any of us would have a problem with that.
And I would just say that number one, and I agree with you, Lawrence, I am not a prohibitionist at all. Bans do not work. We've seen it over and over and over again. The first thing a ban does is establishes the illicit market. And so all of a sudden now you have illegal substances out there that are not tested and they're not necessarily safe for public consumption, that are, are not regulated. And so I'm actually, would be in favor of some regulation to put up some basic guardrails around this, because if you go ahead and schedule it as a drug, you're talking about potential collateral damage to Kratom as a whole. You're talking about opening up the potential for the illicit market. You're talking about restricting consumers from a naturally derived product that they should be able to have access to and it's a 21 and over a product. And that's one of the things we put in policy, right, is make sure it's 21 and over, because then you are essentially just like alcohol and cannabis. You are an adult, you make decisions, you make those decisions because you're an adult and you're responsible for those decisions. And the other thing is, if it goes into the schedule, all research comes to a grinding halt. And that's a really big problem, because here we are talking about over and over again, there's not enough research. If that gets scheduled, you can take research off the table. That's over. And that's been a really big problem in the cannabis world. And we don't want that to happen in the Kratom world. So putting it on the schedule to me is a huge, huge mistake. And I hope that consumers and advocates can continue to speak up and tell their stories so that the federal government doesn't choose to go down that path.
Can you tell me about some interesting peer-reviewed studies or clinical trials that have been conducted on 7-hydroxymitragynine?
Yeah, so the one that I keep alluding to, which looks at the LD50, I think that was a pretty interesting one because it also compared mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine to morphine, and so looking at that, it kind of really, that was one of the first studies that I read, and it definitely kind of opened my eyes to just like this kind of like crazy phenomenon that we have where you have an alternative that is much safer, but is on the periphery kind of fighting for its existence versus this other thing that has a pretty low LD50. It's pretty easy relatively to overdose and die from this, is everywhere. And so that's probably kind of the main study that I point to, or to kind of when we talk to our team around, why are we doing this? Like, what's our goal? Kind of stuff like that is, and saving people is kind of what we are really focused on. But to what I was saying earlier, like there really isn't a whole lot of great research out there. I can point to some other stuff, but the interesting thing about the research world is just because you do a study and just because it suggests something doesn't actually kind of tell you a whole lot. It's totally possible that another study doing the same thing kind of refutes those findings. And so, I would say overall, there's definitely a overall lack of research, and that's kind of one area where we're really trying to solve for.
And I would just like to just add to that, this is where we are. There haven't been a lot of large scale clinical trials yet on Kratom. They're mostly been on animals, on mice. And those are the things that we need to get to. We need to be able to get to those clinical trials. I've spent a good amount of time with Kratom consumers who are in rehab facilities. And one of the things that I have noted over and over and over again is that virtually nobody is using Kratom by itself. They're always using Kratom with fill in the blank, with gabapentin or with whatever. And so it's also really hard to determine what is the direct impact of Kratom. And unless we get to those clinical trials in humans, we're not going to get that information, because right now, if you hear somebody struggling with addiction, abuse, withdrawals, symptoms, whatever, and you start to ask them, well, have you had more than Kratom? And 9.5 out of 10 times, it's going to be a yeah. I've got this and this and this in my system. So how do we really know? This is something we struggled with in cannabis too. We have a law, for example, in California, that no alcohol and no cannabis can be consumed and or sold in the same place. And people want that to happen. And I understand why they want that to happen. But at the same time, as soon as somebody goes and smokes cannabis and then they get into an accident, let's say, and you check it out, again, most of the time there's alcohol involved. But who's going to get the blame? Cannabis is going to get the blame, but it's really not the cannabis that caused the accident. So these are the kinds of things that we have to be able to have that ability to continue research. And if we end up on the schedule, that research goes away. And we really need to be able to do that for consumer safety. Number one, most important thing, safety first.
If you could design your dream study and execute it, what would that study look like? What would it focus on? As vague or as specific as you'd like?
Yeah, so I don't think there's one dream study. I mean, I think in any clinical trial or in any type of research, the dream study are people that are in the study who adhere to all the rules, document everything.
That's interesting.
And give you clean data, right? The reason why, as an example, the reason why we know so little about weight loss is because it's really, really difficult to regulate people. It's really, really difficult to know, like, hey, for the 6 months of this trial that we ran, we know for sure that they didn't eat ice cream. They didn't eat any other things. They only ate at these times. Like, regulating people is a really hard thing because we really like our freedom. And so that's the perfect study, is people that see the value of having great data and having great research and are willing to inconvenience themselves to be able to give the world this knowledge. Assuming that we had that, I think the first place that I would want to go to is looking at the effects of frequency and duration for usage of 7-hydroxymitragynine and Kratom as a whole. So meaning, if you take it every day versus twice a day versus once a week, how does that impact you over time? If you take it pretty consistently for a month, what does that look like afterwards? What does that look like for your pain? What does that look like for any adverse effects you have? How about 3 months? How about 6 months? And I think that those two areas, like if we had a much better understanding, or at least could say, like, hey, compared to the current stuff on the market, as it pertains to addressing pain or addressing addiction, like, this is way better. And I would love to get there. And even if the results are way worse, like, I would at least like to have that, so then we can then say, like, hey, like, maybe this is not the right path for us to be going down. But yeah, those are the two areas where there really is no research and we need something. The problem is it's very expensive to do that stuff.
I'm seeing these products, 7 ohms cones, and they have 7-hydroxy and 8 and 9-hydroxy. Is there something I'm missing? I've never heard of these before. Could you explain what that is? I know I just got this question today, and someone sent me a link to it, and it was very perplexing. I didn't know that there was an 8-hydroxy, 9-hydroxy. Is this just marketing, or?
Yeah, that is definitely not naturally occurring alkaloids within the kratom plant. So my guess is either that is just marketing and has no meaning behind it, or that is like a completely synthesized molecule. My guess is it's marketing. It's like kind of a difficult thing to synthesize 7-hydroxy. So I guess like adding like another chain is possible, but my guess is this is just kind of like bad marketing.
Cool. And what is your relationship with the American Kratom Association, if any?
That's a great question. I feel like, Jackie, we've reached out to them, right?
Yeah, well, we have.
Yeah.
We're right now we're forging a relationship. It's brand new with the American Kratom Association, and one of the reasons we hadn't reached out to them before was because we sort of had at Seven Ohms, we sort of had our own vision on what the policy should look like for 7-hydroxy particularly. So, but there are the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which is developed and designed by the American Kratom Association, and is in, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 states, somewhere. It keeps changing the number, but somewhere around there right now, is pretty good. It's not perfect for us. And that's one of the reasons that we've reached out to say, hey, can we come together as an industry to settle on what we want these regulations to look like and go forward together instead of you do you, us do us, and that guy over there does that guy. That doesn't work as well. So we're putting out our efforts to come together with them, and hopefully they'll be open to hearing our perspectives and working together with us on that, because we'd like to work with them as well.
I'm seeing all these fly-by-night 7-hydroxy brands and gas stations and head shops. What's going on in the market right now? What's going on there? And I know I think, Greg, you cautioned against using some of their products. Could you elaborate further? And are there any 7-OH brands right now who are doing it right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in general, whenever there's money to be made, you will see copycats. So before we launched our product on the market, we didn't see a single 7-hydroxy brand. And then as soon as we launched, within 3 months, we saw 30 different brands. And then, 3 months after that, 29 of those were out, and then a new 30 were in. And so, it's a pretty kind of normal thing to see. I would say that I'm personally not really a kratom user. I do a lot of our product testing, but more just because we want to understand, for somebody that isn't a kratom user, how is this going to affect them? So I cannot personally speak to, any other brands that I would say are doing it right. Yeah, I was looking at Test My Kratom the other day, and I think there was a couple brands that had like an A on there, or like seemed to have some pretty good test results. So if I were a regular user, that's probably where I would go, just to kind of see like what's in all the stuff that's out there. But yeah, I think the other thing is, like, since we started, we've had brands ask us to white label our tablets. So like, can you guys press these tablets, send it to us, we'll put it in our packaging. And we really haven't done that up until now. So, TBD on if we do that in the future. I suppose if we, have enough interest, we might consider it. But currently, we don't supply product for any other brands. And yeah, I would say, though, it's kind of a normal thing. I remember when we first started we actually saw some companies that actually had our exact same branding, exact same color palette, exact same like fonts for the logos. There's still a couple of them out today. There's actually a 7 Ohms chocolate where we have no idea who's making this. It doesn't seem like it's selling that well, but yeah, it's at first the guys were pretty pissed off about this, but it's the nature of the game. It's flattery comes with the territory of being imitated. So we just kind of accepted it and do what we can. But I imagine we are going to see this for a while, because it's really not that expensive to, buy some low-grade tablets and throw them in 1,000 packages and then sell them to your local smoke shops.
Cool. You mentioned profit. How are you guys doing? What's your profit margin like? How's business, so to speak?
Yeah, we're now in a place where we're doing okay. We had taken out a lot of money in like loans and investor money in order to build out our lab and actually kind of develop all the technology here. So most of our life has been, trying to be able to pay off those loans, pay off kind of everything that we borrowed in order to get us to where we are today. I would say where the company is definitely in a healthy place, and that's kind of why at this moment we are looking to start to do research. And actually, just to go back on the earlier conversation around our relationship with the AKA and things like that, like I just want to call out that another reason why from the beginning we haven't really prioritized building these kind of more political relationships is because we kind of see how some of these players are strategizing within the space and what they're prioritizing. And in the sense that, you look at the AKA and they're very focused on legislation. They're very focused at the state and federal level on, passing regulations to make Kratom, legal and safe. And same thing with 7-hydroxy. And so versus our kind of thought process from the very beginning was we can't wait till we've paid off all of our debts and we have some extra money so that we can start to fund research. Because for us, that's kind of where it's at is, we want more transparency. We want to understand kind of what this stuff does from every angle. And so it was kind of, when we look at brands like OPMS or other big players in the space that have been, basically printing money for 10 plus years, it's like, we kind of looked at that and we're like, wow, like how has there been so much money being made in this space yet there's like so little information on what this does? And we didn't really feel good about that. And we wanted to kind of be different, which is another reason why we haven't really focused on kind of the AKA or things like that. And instead, we're focusing our resources on being able to pay for all the research needed to get to more visibility around this.
Okay. And some brands are having the 7-hydroxy bake sale, like the Girl Scouts or something. They've got the cookies and the gummies and see nasal sprays. Are you guys going to branch out into any of that, or have you, if I'm speaking out of ignorance? Also, one listener wanted to know, would you be willing to do powder in the future? Is that coming?
Yeah. So good questions. So in terms of different product SKUs, we are looking into doing that. Our team are perfectionists. And so when you look at a lot of the drinks on the market, most of the drinks on the market, if not all of them, they don't test well. If you don't get it within like a week or two of it getting produced, all the 7-hydroxy has basically died. 7-hydroxy is a really sensitive alkaloid. And so any type of acidity breaks it down very quickly. There's actually a paper about this that kind of shows that with like a normal level of acidity and heat, the half-life of 7-hydroxy is around 4 hours. So, and 7-hydroxy does not taste very good. It's very bitter. And so the way that you kind of get around that really bitter taste is through like acidic flavors. And so that tends to really break it down. And so we basically like had a drink ready, but we've kind of been like tirelessly experimenting and tweaking and testing to get to the point where we really feel like it's perfect. And so same thing with gummies. Gummies are also like a very difficult thing. To be able to suspend an alkaloid inside of like a gelatinous kind of compound is a very, very difficult thing to do. And that's also why gummies is such a small part of the Kratom world, because they taste terrible and they don't really do a whole lot. And so we've kind of been biding our time and waiting until we have what we think is perfect. And so, I imagine in the next month or two, we will probably start to release probably in very small amounts, because we want to do a large test before we kind of roll out everywhere. But we do feel pretty confident that we have the best tasting and also safest and most potent drink shot on the market.
Is it true? I've heard it said that 7-hydroxy has a longer half-life than just straight mitragynine.
That is not my understanding. My understanding is that it is the opposite.
Me too.
So what happens though is as things oxidize, they change. So mitragynine oxidizes into 7-hydroxy, and then 7-hydroxy over periods of time will oxidize into a bunch of different things, one of which is pseudoindoxyl. I would say that 7-hydroxy is probably one of the most unstable alkaloids that is in the Kratom leaf. I mean, if this were the case, that we would have released a 7-hydroxy shot long before you see MIDI shots on the market.
Okay, and to close the show, what do you see as the future of 7-ohms, of 7-hydroxy? What are some big dream projects you're working on? I know you've mentioned some, but if you could leave us feeling hopeful for the future, so to speak, both of you.
One of the things that really gets me excited is in the beverage department is the idea of on-site consumption. If the manufacturers, 7-ohms and so forth can develop Kratom beverages that taste good, because that is the challenge right now, that taste good, there could be, and there's some discussion about this, about the idea of on-site consumption, having it allowed to be served at certain locations, yet to be determined what those locations are. But that is just like in the cannabis space, where on-site consumption is also a really sort of forward-thinking final destination of where the consumer can actually safely enjoy, in that case, a cannabis beverage in a legal licensed facility that is regulated and the product's been tested and it's safe for human consumption. That same idea with Kratom is right there behind it. And I think that's a very exciting vision down the road. I don't really know if it's all that far away, but it could be a couple of years away. But that to me is one of those sort of future visions that we've got.
Yeah. I think for me, I am most excited, and I think I speak for our team as well. Like, we are most excited for the research and kind of watching as we progress down this road of really getting bulletproof data around the effects of 7-hydroxy. I think that I remember like very vividly, pretty recently, we had just gotten to the point where we sent off the last payment to pay off all the debts of the company. And I was talking to our chief science officer, and we're kind of just talking about like, man, it is so crazy that, most startups die. So the fact that we didn't die, and the fact that we've done well enough to be able to pay back everyone, so we don't kind of feel this weight of being personally on the hook for some of these loans, like, it's such a great feeling. And he looks at me and he's like, well, yeah, that's cool. But we have to remember that ultimately, if fentanyl wasn't a thing, if heroin wasn't a thing, if Oxycontin wasn't a thing, if so many people that we love were not dying from these things, we wouldn't be doing this. We'd be working on other drugs. We'd be working on other drugs, trying to solve other problems that are much more pressing. So we can't lose sight of the fact that ending this opioid epidemic, as crazy as that sounds, to think that some no-name company like us can even have an impact on that. It's crazy to say that out loud, but that is kind of our North Star. And until we get to that point, we don't really intend on stopping.
Awesome. Well, you all demanded it and we supplied it, 7-ohms. I've waited a long time for this day. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure speaking with you, Jackie and Greg. Signing out.